examples of that. If you look around today, you can see a lot of examples where people are trapped inside of religions that are embedded in some aspect of their culture, and because of that, it becomes a thick veil for them. It's hard for them to escape, and it's hard for the Lord to break through. Okay, well, probably if you consider this, the number one historical example of religion becoming a replacement for Christ was the Jewish religion at the time of Christ, and then at the time of the apostles after the Lord's resurrection. While the Lord was on the earth, when he was living his human life on the earth, the main opposition that he faced, it came from the Jewish religious leaders. Eventually, they're the ones who crucified him and then tried to cover up his resurrection. But after the Lord was crucified and resurrected, if you read the book of Acts, actually many of the Jews, many of the people in Jerusalem who formerly were Jews, ended up believing in the Lord. And ultimately, what caused the biggest problem in the early church, it wasn't the direct opposition from the Jews to the believers in Jesus, like during the time when the Lord was on the earth, but it was questions about what to do with their old religion of Judaism. That's actually one of the main historical themes in the Bible, and you can see the seeds of it in the book of Acts, and then in the epistles it's spelled out more and more clearly, especially in the epistles of Paul, like in Galatians and in Hebrews. And eventually that's what resulted in the Lord having to send the Roman army to destroy the city of Jerusalem in AD 70 to clear up the mixture that was there. Okay, well, I'm just thinking about this, it's one thing to kind of reflect on this historically, but it's also good to try to see this from another point of view, which is, if we were the Jewish believers, what would our response have been during the time of Acts? And I'm not convinced that apart from the Lord's mercy, we would have done any better than the Jewish believers in this regard of receiving the gospel and leaving our old practices. The reason for that is because at that time, the Jewish religion, it was the God-given religion on the earth. If you think about it, the requirement to keep the Sabbath, just as an example, that was actually one of the 10 commandments that was given by God to Moses. When you read the Old Testament, you probably remember in the book of Numbers that there's this story where there was a man who was gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. And after they caught him, they took him to Moses and Aaron. I think they took him to the tents of meeting before Jehovah. And Jehovah pronounced judgment on him, and the judgment was death. I think all the people stoned him. But anyway, the judgment was death for breaking the Sabbath. Well, now you just imagine if you were a Jewish believer at that time who had, at the time of the Lord, after the Lord's resurrection, let's say, who grew up believing in the one true God, who was ingrained inside of this culture. Maybe even when you were growing up, you heard this story told in the synagogues. If you were a Jewish believer like that, you would probably be very cautious about any teaching that was telling you that you don't need to keep the Sabbath. And there are other similar elements of the Jewish religion, like the dietary regulations and the keeping of their festivals and feasts. I mean, these are things that were ordained by God in the Old Testament as a part of their law and its ordinances. And so to stop doing these things or to break the rules in the Old Testament dispensation, it was very serious. This was ingrained into their culture, and that was one of the reasons why it became a stumbling block and a veil that prevented them from fully entering into God's New Testament economy. Well, one of the central themes that you can see in Paul's ministry, and you can see this in many of his writings, you can even somewhat consider Acts as being at least influenced by Paul, because it was written by Luke. And so one of the central themes which you can see in a lot of Paul's writings is that all of the positive things in the Old Testament, including the ceremonial law and the ordinances and the feasts, they were all pictures and shadows which in the New Testament are replaced by Christ. Paul actually uses the word shadows. In these verses that we read earlier in the message, it mentions the word shadows several times. Well, for us to say this as New Testament believers here, that Christ is the reality of all of these types from the Old Testament. I mean, we have the New Testament in our hand. And so for us to say that is one thing. But for Paul to see this, because remember, Paul was raised as a devout Jew. And for the Jewish believers during Paul's time to see this and to be delivered from their old religion and come into the New Testament, it was a big deal. For Paul to see this, it was profound. It took direct revelation from God. And you can see even among Christians now, even among many believers, there's some confusion about whether or not you need to keep certain aspects of the Old Testament. And even for those of us who are somewhat more clear about it, it's possible that in some respects we haven't been delivered from all of the shadows, and that we need to be delivered further to experience Christ as the reality of all